Back on August 30th, the motion picture community lost one of its most well-known and influential filmmakers, Wes Craven, who created such memorable films as A Nightmare on Elm Street, the Scream trilogy, and The Hills Have Eyes. Tonight, we'll be looking at his very first major motion picture as writer and director. Here's your damn rant show, folks. Greetings, I am E. Adam Thomas, and welcome to Film Rants, taking your favorite movies out to the lake and having a little fun with them. Tonight we're looking at Wes Craven's first film, The Last House on the Left, starring David Hess. Made in 1972 on a budget of $90,000, Last House is considered one of the most iconic and influential films in the modern horror genre. The plot, as listed on IMDb, is pretty straightforward. A pair of teenage girls are headed to a rock concert for one's birthday. When trying to score pot in the city, the girls are kidnapped by a gang of psychotic convicts. Now, for fans of 1970s horror films in general, the plot is actually in and of itself pretty tame when compared to films like like the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. But in a lot of ways, this film is far more horrific. Craven's script was originally written to be more of a horror porno, but even with about 80% of the hardcore sexual content taken out of the script, there is some pretty uncomfortable shit in this film. Gore-wise, it's nowhere near as graphic as some of his later horror pieces, but add in the context of the graphic rape and victimization of a pair of teenage girls, and it still becomes a great deal more visceral and emotionally wrenching in the long run. When I watched this film in my youth, it was just gross and somewhat disturbing. Now, as the father of two daughters, it's a lot more upsetting, let me tell you. And at first, the way the parents of Mari, one of the two girls, the one who's having the birthday, gets the revenge on the assailants, seems like it would be exquisitely cathartic and satisfying. In reality, however, that really would have butt-fucked their lives in some pretty awful ways. Their daughter is still dead, and now they're guilty of a triple homicide. The courts of the 1970s probably would have had a little bit of lenience toward them, but the trauma of what they experienced and what they did ultimately would have destroyed their lives, something you don't think about when you're watching this film in your 20s. This film is actually based on a 1960 Swedish film, The Virgin Spring by Ingmar Bergman, but this film is not intended to be a contender to that, and that's a good thing. Because from a quality standpoint, it is blatantly obvious that the filmmaker was a complete novice. Let me just preface the rest of this rant by saying that Wes Craven never did set out to be another Bergman or Kurosawa or anything like that. He's a guy who enjoyed making films, but never suffered any delusions of being one of the so-called greats, even within the confines of the horror genre. If there was anything about his body of work he did seem to regret, though, it's that he was rarely afforded the opportunity to branch out into other types of films. He did get a chance to direct Meryl Streep in a straightforward dramatic film called Music of the Heart in 1999, which was a critical success. But once you've given the world Freddy Krueger, it's pretty hard to wash those finger knives clean. This film is far from his greatest work. It's out of focus half the time. It attempts to pad out the runtime with scenic shots, and they become obvious and very tiresome, and some of the editing really does leave a lot to be desired. It's not a good film. It comes off as very dated, although given the budget that he was working with, that can be forgiven. It was, after all, the early 1970s, and people had even worse taste in couture than they did in the 80s. Ironically, the best-dressed characters in the whole film are the ones you're supposed to be hating on. It seems to me that the doctor and his wife should be the ones with the less outlandish outfits, but it doesn't work out that way. They look like a couple of weirdos from an episode of Scooby-Doo, not the distraught parents of a daughter who's been brutally raped and killed. One thing that you would think would have suck-started this film into a warp-driven voyage into cinematic fuck-this-shitism, oddly, though, works to this film's favor, and that is the soundtrack. On the surface, it seems like a pretty weird choice, incongruously playing light bluegrass ditties over some pretty dark moments. But what becomes evident when you actually listen to David Hess's lyrics is that the music actually helps tell the story of the film through the minds of the criminals. It even makes more sense after brutally murdering Mari, the killers are caught off guard, experiencing a moment of self-loathing and remorse. It brings to mind the question, are these three horrifically depraved fucksticks really certifiable sociopaths? Or did they each, at some point in their lives, have an admirable moral center that circumstances of life ended up twisting and destroying through some traumatic event? Had things happened differently in their past, could these three people have ended up as saviors instead of nihilistic terror beasts? Craven shows some burgeoning ability to think deeper than the surface of his subject matter, which in a way does show a glimmer of influence from the director of the film that Last House was inspired by. This film, as basically dreadful as it is, also shows the beginnings of some of Wes's long-term trademarks. Strong female characters and inventive cleverness of the supposed heroes of the piece are themes Wes would revisit often in his later films. One last thing. Wes Craven's name will never be held in as high esteem as some other directors, but that should not be taken as a slam against him. The fact is that he has created a body of work that is as often awesome as it is awful. Yes, I am one of those assholes who thinks the Scream films were only vaguely funny and otherwise just annoying as fuck, but by the same token, one of his most forgotten films, The Serpent and the Rainbow, which was amazingly effective as both a horror film and a suspense thriller, is one of my favorites. Now, before it becomes the name of the show, let's get a little bit more mileage out of the Film Rants Rantometer, shall we? Artistic gets a 3. Primarily because the basic storyline is well thought out and actually fairly believable. Coolness gets a 2.5. Because, well, it is kind of cool in spots. Originality also gets a 2.5. Because it is actually not really derivative of any other horror films. And in fact, many other horror films are more derivative of this film. Suckitude, sadly, gets a full 5. Largely due to Craven's obvious inexperience as a filmmaker, because a lot of the basic technical aspects of the film craft are so badly mishandled. That gives Last House on the Left a total score of 3. Rightly deserving of its status as part of a new wave of horror films that came out in the 1970s, but also deserving of the same criticisms that it is a poorly shot and poorly edited film that serves as an example of what not to do when making a film. That finishes up October's Horror Request Month, even though this one was basically requested by myself. But in the meantime, remember, we're always hoping to hear from you. Email me at filmrantseat@cox.net. Comment on this video here on YouTube, or just look us up on Facebook at www.facebook.com/filmrantseat. In December, the new show, The Rantometer, will be premiering, but Film Rants isn't quite over yet. One more episode will air in November, featuring 2 completely different films in one episode and a bit of a retrospective look back. You'll have to tune in to find out what movies those are, but in the meantime, parents, please make sure your daughter's cell phones are charged. Good night.
Angry Men Reviews. Many fucks said, no fucks given.
Fuck 'em, kill 'em, and eat 'em, boys. Go ahead.
Mecha, Godzilla, and the Dalek, they're best of friends, they like to play. They go to the park and play with frisbees, although the Dalek's not very good at throwing it. But he can shoot it out of the air. Duda. Now I'm done.